silence of the Appalachians was not merely a lack of noise. It was a physical weight, thick enough to lean against. Up here, where the land tilted toward 3 state lines and the road stopped fighting the mud, sound traveled differently. It did not dissipate. It compressed, trapped beneath the dense green canopy of old pines and hemlocks. You could hear the dust settle. You could hear the moss sigh when a foot shifted weight. And if a person listened close enough, the wet, persistent thump of the heart struggling with the altitude was always audible. Nathan Cole, a retired sergeant, came here for the quiet. Not for peace. Peace was a lie the politicians sold. He came for the routine of the quiet, the dependable predictability of isolation. The cabin was rough-hewn, smelling permanently of pine resin, damp wood, and the faint, sweet scent of cold ashes. Morning light filtered through a smog of early mist and dust motes, laid pale yellow stripes across the floorboards. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, methodically breaking down his Remington rifle. The metallic scent of cleaner, lubricant, protectant oil, and cold steel provided comfort. It was the smell of competence, the aroma of a life lived by precise, repeatable actions. He had been here 7 months. This was enough time for the civilian flesh to soften the hard edges of military discipline, but not enough time for the scars to fade. They never faded. He wiped the bolt clean, running a patch down the bore, listening to the small, gritty scratch of the carbon coming loose. It was on the 3rd day of that particular week that the silence broke. It arrived not with a crack, but with a deep, muffled resonance that traveled up through the stone foundation and settled in Nathan's sternum. The sound made his teeth ache. He instantly rejected the obvious rationalizations. A rock slide was impossible. The air was still. A black bear perhaps rolling a heavy boulder. He had dealt with bears. They grunted, they roared. They moved with sloppy, ursine weight. This sound was different. It possessed a controlled fury, too human in its inherent bitterness, yet impossibly powerful. It was the sound of something deeply, spiritually wounded, smashing something infinitely hard. He went outside. The air was cool, hovering around 48 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling of impending rain and wet earth. He stood for a long 5 minutes, letting his instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through 3 overseas deployments, parse the forest. The birds were silent. The usual chatter of squirrels and jays had been vacuumed out of the air. He followed the faint reverberation moving downhill toward the creek, where the runoff carved granite into smooth gray slabs. The sound did not repeat, but the feeling lingered. A heavy echo in his gut. When he reached the creek bank, he found the evidence. They were deep indentations, wide as a man's fist, pressed deep into the packed mud at the water's edge. They did not resemble a bear's paw, which was rounded and flat, or a mountain lion's, which was padded and neat. These were different. In the mud, and disturbingly, pressed into the surface of a submerged piece of shale, were 5 distinct, deep gouges. They were razor-sharp, as if steel talons had been used to pry up the earth. Nathan knelt. A normal wolf print measured perhaps 4 inches across. These prints were nearly 9 inches, and the strength required to score granite like that defied the natural biomechanics of any known creature in North America. He knew immediately this was not a rare, massive timber wolf, and it was certainly not a hybrid. Wolves did not intentionally shatter rock. These indentations showed not just immense power, but a deliberate, painful attempt to tear something apart. the marks of focused rage. His rational mind retreated, leaving a cold vacuum of certain knowledge in its place. The routine was destroyed. The silence was compromised. Nathan returned to the cabin not for comfort, but for preparation. Over the next 2 days, discipline took over. The cottage, meant to be a refuge, transformed back into an outpost. He began methodically reinforcing the perimeter. He drove stakes into the ground, setting up discrete acoustic sensors and tripwires powered by small batteries. He mounted 2 thermal cameras high up in the dense branches of the tallest pines, aimed to give him broad coverage of the slopes to the north and east, the directions from which the resonant sound originated. He checked the sight picture on the Remington rifle, loaded new magazines for the service pistol he kept close, and laid out his survival pack. It was instinctive. The language of preparation overrode any civilian impulse to dismiss the tracks as merely strange. His survival instinct, long dormant, caged by the mundane demands of retirement, surged awake, demanding action and countermeasures. The dread did not arrive with a bang. It seeped in, slowly filling the crevices of the quiet air. The second night after finding the tracks was particularly still. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees, and the low-hanging mist had condensed into a heavy, damp fog that wrapped around the cabin like a shroud. Nathan was cleaning the lens of one of the handheld thermal monoculars when he noticed the smell. It was not wood smoke, pine needles, or the comforting scent of rain. It was a deeply unsettling combination. Moist earth overlaid with a distant, faint, sour, metallic aroma. It was iron and ozone, like blood mixed with the tang of electrical short-circuiting. But beneath that, there was a smell that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. The sickly, acrid scent of burned flesh and stale, stagnant water. He stood by the back door, listening to the heavy thud of his blood in his ears. The cameras ran. The sensors were armed. He was prepared for a large predator, perhaps even a rogue pack of mountain lions. But this smell suggested something that had crawled out of a contaminated ditch, something that carried its own atmosphere of decay and ruin. He stared into the fog. The thermal imaging screen showed only the pulsing heat of the nearby trees and the steady, cooler outline of the cabin structure. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. But the scent was definitive, strong enough to suggest proximity, yet vague enough to deny a precise direction. Nathan did not sleep that night. Every subtle shift in the wind, every creak of the old timbers, forced him to grip the pistol tucked beneath his pillow. He lay rigid, the metallic taste of the air growing stronger, feeling the vast, silent weight of the Appalachian dark pressing in on his small, fragile perimeter. He knew with cold certainty that whatever had left those impossible tracks was still out there, breathing the same heavy air, and it was watching his light. The quiet of the mountains was over. Something monstrous was moving into the neighborhood. The next morning, Nathan moved from passive observation to active reconnaissance. His soldier's mind demanded closure, a defined threat assessment. He could not fight a phantom, but he could certainly track one. He followed the creek uphill, away from the cabin. The forest immediately became thicker, denser. The morning light struggled to penetrate the multi-layered canopy, filtering down in meager, dusty shafts. The air grew heavier, thick with moisture and the deep, rich smell of decomposing matter. But the offensive, metallic tang of the night before still lingered, faint now, like a residue on the cold stones. The tracks continued, intermittent but distinct, leading him over slick moss and through tight clusters of rhododendron. What he observed went far beyond mere strength. Along one narrow game trail, a mature maple nearly 10 inches in diameter lay prone. It had not been sawed. It had not been toppled by high winds, because the nearby younger saplings stood undisturbed. The maple had been yanked out of the ground. Its root ball, massive and heavy, lay tilted, the earth clinging to it ripped and fragmented. The wood was not snapped cleanly. It was splintered and shredded near the base, as if it had been bitten through with malicious, repetitive force. Nathan crouched, running his hand over the splintered wood. Whatever did this did not just walk through the forest. It asserted brutal dominance over it. He moved further up the slope, reaching the perimeter where he had set his thermal cameras. He pulled the chip from the camera mounted highest in the oak. Back at the cabin, sipping bitter coffee, he reviewed the footage. The camera captured mostly deer, raccoons, and the occasional owl. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of the previous night, the thermal register jumped. A massive heat signature, too indistinct to be identified, moved with blinding speed. It registered as a shapeless, amorphous blur, filling the bottom third of the frame for perhaps 1/10 of a second, vanishing before the next frame loaded. It was too fast for its indicated size. If the heat signature corresponded to a physical being, it weighed upwards of 400 pounds, yet it glided through the dense undergrowth without generating the slightest acoustic reading on the nearby sensors. No rustle of leaves, no snapping twig. Its locomotion was silent, impossible. Nathan, the former operator, did not believe in fairy tales. He believed in logistics, physics, and empirical evidence. But the physics were clearly broken here. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Control. That was what fear was, the perceived absence of control. To regain command, he had to define the enemy. He returned to the slope, working methodically, covering a wider grid. He sought a direct physical sample. He found it near a small, rocky overhang, snagged on the jagged edge of an exposed quartz seam. It was hair, or rather fur, not black, like a typical Appalachian bear, and not the gray-brown of the eastern wolf. This was ash-gray, almost silvery, but utterly lifeless. He pulled a few strands free and inspected them. They were astonishingly thick, each strand the diameter of heavy fishing line, coarse and brittle. He carefully placed the sample in a sterile plastic baggie from his first aid kit. As he sealed the bag, his fingers brushed against the dead matter. A jolt, intensely cold, ran up his arm. He brought the bag close to his face, inhaling cautiously. The metallic ozone scent was concentrated here, strong and immediate. It smelled precisely like the air after a lightning strike, mixed with a deeper, unsettling odor of decomposition and a chemical quality like battery acid spilled on concrete. Rationalization finished, he thought, staring at the sample. This was not a wolf. This was not a bear. This was something else. He spent the afternoon driving down the access road toward the only sign of civilization, a small, unincorporated community 20 miles away, largely populated by old families who kept to themselves. He needed local knowledge. He found old Sam, the local ranger, sitting outside a dilapidated general store, whittling a stick into oblivion. Sam was pushing 70. His face a map of sun damage and hard living. Nathan offered Sam a can of tobacco and steered the conversation carefully. He described a big wolf he had seen, noting its unusual size and the strange, deep tracks it left. Sam chewed slowly, the movement in his jaw agonizingly slow. His eyes, usually a watery blue, darted nervously toward the high western ridge, the very slope Nathan had just left. "Sounds like you went poking where you shouldn't, son." Sam finally grunted, spitting a stream of dark juice onto the dirt. "Ain't no wolves that size, not anymore. Haven't been since the 1960s. Nathan pressed him about the ridge. "I saw some old marks up near the high crossing. People avoid that area." Sam's body language stiffened, the whittling knife pausing mid-slice. His eyes were suddenly wide, full of a deep, primal panic that Nathan recognized instantly. It was the look of a man who knew the difference between danger and damnation. "That's the Forbidden Hill, Sergeant. Has been since before your daddy was born. Things go up there in the winter and they don't come back down. Never hunt there. Never set foot past the timber line when the moon is high. You hear me?" Sam did not offer legends or phantasm stories. He offered bald animal fear. He spoke of them that sleeps in the quiet teeth. He then clamped his mouth shut, refusing to speak another word, trembling slightly as he stared toward the distant peaks. Nathan had seen that kind of terror only once before, in a recruit facing certain capture. Returning to the cabin, Nathan shifted his focus. If the creature was real, it had prey, and if it had prey, it likely had pursuers. Just 2 miles down the logging trail, hidden beneath a cluster of dense hemlock, he found the camp. It was professional. 3 large camouflage tents, arranged in a tight triangle. Expensive, high-grade nylon, not tourists. 2 heavy-duty trucks were parked discreetly away from the main clearing. Nathan used his binoculars from a distance, hidden by the thick brush. They had high-powered rifles with massive scopes mounted on tripods. Communication equipment was military-grade radios. The men moved with a practiced economy of motion. They were not hunting deer. They were hunting something massive, elusive, and dangerous. They knew what was here. Nathan stayed hidden, observing until the sun bled out of the sky. The forest was heavy with expectation. Around 11:30 o'clock in the evening, the night ripped open. It was not a gunshot. It was not the guttural, echoing howl Nathan had expected from the tracks. It was a human voice. It started high, a thin, shrill note of absolute, unadulterated terror, the kind of sound that strips the soul naked. It stretched, wavering on the edge of hysteria and raw pain, before being violently, surgically cut short. The sound did not fade. It was deleted, leaving behind an instantaneous dead silence that was far heavier than the previous mountain quiet. Nathan lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking despite himself. The light in the center tent of the hunter's camp winked out abruptly. In the dead air, Nathan smelled the ozone again, stronger now, tinged with a fresh, sickening, metallic sweetness. He knew with absolute clarity that one of the professional hunters had just met something far beyond his experience, and had not survived the encounter. The line between rational threat and outright nightmare had just been crossed. Nathan did not sleep that night. He monitored the hunter's camp for movement, but the clearing remained utterly dark and still, a black hole in the pre-dawn mist. The decisiveness of the silence declared their total compromise. He packed his sidearm and a medic kit, moving down the slope well before the sun topped the eastern peaks. His destination was the creek, the closest source of fresh water, and a natural choke point for any large creature in this terrain. The morning was cold, damp, and gray, around 41 degrees Fahrenheit. A thick layer of frost coated the rocks. As he approached the stretch of smooth shale where he had found the tracks days before, he heard it. A ragged, wet sound of struggling breath, agonizingly close. He drew the pistol, moving slowly around a large cluster of river birches. Lying slumped against a cold, slick boulder was a man. He was pale, almost translucent, his skin the waxy color of old bone china. He was dressed in expensive, heavy tweed, now ripped and sodden, clinging to a frame that indicated height and immense physical power, even in repose. The man was alive, but barely. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rasping gasps. But it was his hands that drew Nathan's immediate horrified attention. Both forearms were scored with deep, jagged lacerations, massive wounds that looked less like cuts and more like the earth had been torn open. Dark, thick blood, almost the color of crude oil, seeped sluggishly from the wounds and stained the gray stone. But the wounds were wrong. Even as Nathan watched, a laceration running from the man's wrist up to his elbow began to knit. It did not scab over. It retracted. The edges of the flesh pulled together, the skin tightening, shrinking the gash as if an invisible thread was rapidly stitching the muscle and dermis together. The entire process was accelerated, defying natural human biology. Nathan, despite every instinct telling him to aim and shoot the thing that defied medical science, approached cautiously. This was not a human being, but it was behaving like a desperately injured one. "Don't," the man whispered, his voice dry and hoarse, yet carrying an unsettling rumble of authority. "Don't touch the wounds. They close better on their own." Nathan lowered his weapon, but kept his stance rigid. He offered a canteen. The man accepted it, drinking deeply like an animal, gulping the cold water down in massive swallows. "Who are you?" Nathan asked, his voice low and controlled. "Randall," the man replied, sitting up slowly, a feat of resilience given the visible trauma. His accent was precise, old-fashioned, carrying a patrician weight that felt utterly out of place in the soaked Appalachian wilderness. "And you, I believe, are the current tenant of that drafty hunting box uphill." His eyes were the most disturbing feature. They were not human brown or blue. They were a vivid, burning amber, and they looked through Nathan, not at him. They assessed him not as a person, but as a mechanism, a set of functions and capabilities. There was an icy, high-definition intelligence in their depths. In defiance of every rule he knew, Nathan helped Randall walk back toward the cabin. The man was unbelievably heavy, his musculature dense and unforgiving, like handling lengths of steel cable wrapped in skin. Inside, Nathan forced Randall to sit by the cold hearth. He cleaned the last open wounds with alcohol wipes, ignoring the thick, oily quality of the blood. The flesh beneath his fingers felt hot, vibrating with unnatural energy. "Poachers," Randall said, accepting a cup of coffee that Nathan poured. His composure was unnerving, given that he had essentially just finished bleeding to near death. They came for a trophy. They believed they were hunting simple beasts. Randall shifted, his tweed coat revealing massive, deep claw marks across his chest, marks that were also rapidly sealing into scars. "My line," Randall continued, his voice heavy with ancient, resigned sadness, "has guarded this pass for centuries. We were the custodians. They destroyed more than a pack of large wolves. They destroyed the ancient line of defense, the primary barrier." "Defense against what?" Nathan asked. wiping the metallic sweat from his own brow. Randall only stared into the rising steam of the coffee, against chaos, against things that do not abide by the rules of transformation or intelligence, against the things they unleashed with their amateur violence. The afternoon wore on. Randall did not sleep, did not eat. He politely declined the dried venison with a look of profound distaste, but he recovered rapidly. By 4 o'clock, the massive lacerations were merely thick red lines against the white canvas of his skin. Nathan felt the cold hand of cognitive dissonance gripping him. He harbored something that defied reality, yet he felt compelled to offer aid, compelled by the man's sheer, weary authority. Night fell heavily, bringing a crushing darkness and a resurgence of the rank, sour smell. Nathan, despite his exhaustion, could not trust the quiet. He loaded his service pistol with hollow point ammunition, keeping it in easy reach as he lay in his bunk. A little after 2 o'clock in the morning, a noise startled him awake. Not a crash, but a soft, rhythmic shush. The sound of wet fur brushing against wood, followed by a low, metallic scritch of grinding teeth coming from the living area. Not a snarl, not a grunt. Just a dry, focused scraping. Nathan slipped silently out of the bunk, the pistol trembling slightly in his grasp. He moved to the doorway, peering around the frame. The man was gone. In his place stood a silhouette of impossible size. It was the wolf from the tracks, gigantic, easily 8 feet high, standing on its powerful rear legs, its dense ash-gray fur absorbing the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty window panes. It focused entirely on the window, its stance taut, its head massive. Its eyes, when they caught the ambient light, were the same startling amber, but now ringed with cold, intense alertness. This creature was not a wild beast driven by hunger. This was a sentry. Its shoulders were square, its breathing controlled, its attention fixed on the slopes leading up from the hunter's camp. It was not guarding itself. It guarded the fragile structure, and the man who lay sleeping, or pretending to sleep, inside. Nathan watched for an entire minute, the scent of fresh blood and damp fur heavy in the air. The realization was stark. The beast protected the keeper, and the keeper protected the fragile illusion of order. He slowly retreated to his bunk, the pistol now feeling like an extension of his arm, aimed not outward at the monster, but inward at the impossible reality he now hosted. The morning brought a strange, stark clarity. The wolf was gone, replaced by Randall. He sat by the hearth, which Nathan had finally lit, sipping coffee with impeccable, almost fastidious manners. The smell of damp fur was still present, heavy and masculine, like a deep earth scent after a summer rain. His massive frame strained the wooden chair, but his composure was total. The only residual sign of the night's transformation was the faint steam rising from his shirt, drying out the moisture soaked into his tweed. Randall looked at Nathan, the amber eyes steady and assessing. There was no apology, no shame. Only a quiet, ancient acceptance. "You saw the wolf," Randall stated, his voice low, steady, and heavier than usual. It was the voice of a man accustomed to having his words treated as law. "Now you know who I am. But do you know who follows me?" Nathan sat opposite him, holding his cup with both hands, trying to absorb the heat. "I know you heal fast, and you turn into a creature large enough to yank a maple tree out of the ground. That is outside my operational parameters, Lord Randall." "Operational parameters," Randall echoed, a shade of a smile touching his lips. "I require your parameters, Sergeant Cole. I need your logic, your training, your dedication to detail. My nature is instinct, Yours is defense." Randall then proceeded to explain, not as a desperate man seeking refuge, but as a commander detailing the functional necessity of his existence. He spoke of the old duty. His lineage had maintained the balance in these deep woods for over 1,000 years, ensuring that the transformation, the gift, remained anchored to sanity, to control, and to a strict code of protection. They were wolves of order. The hunters, the poachers Nathan had seen, had targeted Randall's pack deliberately. They did not just want pelts. They were eliminating the hierarchy. When a pure lineage is destroyed, when the Lord is eliminated, or when the pack falls without his immediate control, the gift is corrupted, Randall explained, setting down his cup with a precise click. The survivors lose the ability to shift fully, to retain their minds. They are caught in a permanent, agonizing flux. They become what we call the contaminated. Nathan realized Randall described the things that left the smell of ozone and burnt powder, the things that moved too fast for the thermal cameras. They are no longer wolves or men, Randall said, a note of profound sadness entering his tone. They are shapeless, driven only by the agony of their failed transformation and absolute, indiscriminate hunger. The poachers thought they were eliminating a dangerous species. Instead, they shattered the vase that held the poison. Nathan ran through his tactical assessment. The professionalism of the hunters, the expense of their gear, their focused attack on a specific target, Randall's pack hierarchy. This was not random sport. These hunters, Nathan summarized, leaning forward, they were paid. They were either the first wave meant to clear out the perimeter, or they were simply useful idiots who activated the larger threat. Randall nodded slowly. They were bait, perhaps the fuse. But the chaos they unleashed is real, and it knows no mercy. The contaminated will descend from the higher peaks, where they have been contained for generations by my predecessors. They are a tidal wave of disease and pure predatory spite. He did not ask for help. He offered an alliance, a partnership of necessity. "I am wounded still despite the speed of my healing," Randall said, indicating the fresh scars. "My strength returns, but my instinct is paramount. Your tactical knowledge, your understanding of defensive lines and modern weaponry, it is irreplaceable now. We protect this area, and we prevent the chaos from spreading to the communities down the valley. This is not the defense of a monster, Sergeant. This is the defense of the known world." Nathan stared at the man whose eyes glowed amber, whose body defied biology, and whose existence was utterly insane. Yet Randall's mission, the defense of order, was painfully, reassuringly familiar. It cut through the fog of retirement and the guilt of old failures. Here was an unambiguous threat, a clean target, a definitive purpose. The war had found him again, but this time the enemy was not political or nuanced. It was absolute horror. A strange, sharp feeling of satisfaction settled in Nathan's chest. He was a soldier again, bound by a new, unspoken duty that had nothing to do with flags or presidents. "All right, Lord Randall," Nathan said, finally letting go of the mug, the sound echoing in the small room. "I accept your parameters. We start by fortifying this position. We work on the assumption that anything that moves in the dark is hostile, and we shoot to destroy." Randall gave him a sharp, approving nod. "Good. We begin at once. They will come for the scent of the blood already spilled, and for the chance to eliminate the last of the line." The rest of the morning was spent in focused planning. Randall detailed the natural pathways of the mountains, explaining where the wind would carry scent and where the shadows would gather most deeply. Nathan plotted the tactical advantages: fields of fire, choke points, and kill zones. He realized Randall was a master strategist, thinking in 3 dimensions of terrain, scent, and shadow, where Nathan only thought in sight lines and angles. Randall was still sipping his coffee, entirely human, entirely composed, but the air around him felt charged, like a tightly wound spring waiting for release. Nathan knew that beneath the tailored tweed, the dense, impossible musculature was humming, ready to transform again. The agreement was made on the razor's edge of this impossible reality, sealing a pact rooted in mutual necessity. The war had begun, and Nathan Cole was back in the fight. The cabin, already rugged, was rapidly stripped of its pastoral charm and transformed into a military strongpoint. Nathan moved with the rhythmic efficiency of a man who had done this too many times before. The civilian life melted away like cheap solder, leaving behind the hardened professional. First came the perimeter. Nathan laid thin, almost invisible tripwires linked to noisemakers, mostly cans filled with rocks, designed not to wound but to instantly announce penetration. He planted directional fragmentation mine-style devices, focusing their blast radii away from the cabin itself but toward the most likely approach paths from the steep slope. He was not aiming to eliminate the contaminated with explosives, but to stagger them, to buy precious seconds. He focused heavily on incendiaries. He drained his kerosene lanterns and mixed simple, heavy-duty Molotov cocktails in thick glass bottles, soaking rags in gasoline and wiring them to the necks with copper wire. Fire was a deterrent and a psychological weapon, more effective than bullets against non-rational threats. Randall, remaining in human form for the day, provided uncanny logistical insight. He vetoed several placements based on wind current and expected routes. "Here," Randall instructed, pointing to a depression near a large ancient boulder, "the scent will pool. They will not approach openly. They will follow the low ground. Focus your fire here, not on the crest." Nathan realized Randall's knowledge was less geographic and more biological. He knew how the beast mind worked, where it sought cover, how it utilized scent, where its instinct told it to hunt. He was literally thinking like the enemy, but with higher functioning. They developed a rudimentary signaling system, short, sharp whistles for contact coming in fast. A double tap on the glass of the window for fallback, perimeter breached. Randall grasped the military code with frightening speed, absorbing the tactical language instantly, as though his mind was engineered for command structure. There were moments of stark, unsettling contrast. Around midday, Randall needed sustenance. Nathan had hunted a deer a few weeks prior, freezing the haunches. When Nathan offered to cook a thick steak, Randall declined. He took the meat, still stiff with frost, and retreated to the shaded corner of the porch. Nathan watched, unable to look away, as Randall tore into the raw, frozen muscle with his human teeth, swallowing massive chunks almost whole. His eating was controlled, yet utterly animalistic. Within minutes, the hunger was satisfied. Randall cleaned his mouth with a napkin and returned to the table, discussing ballistics trajectories with the same high-bred calm. The transition from beast to gentleman and back was seamless and terrifying. As dusk approached, the final pieces of the defense were put into place. Nathan used his climbing gear to ascend the highest accessible bluff, a sheer granite face about a mile from the cabin, where he had a sweeping view of the valley below and the higher slopes above. He mounted his best long-range thermal camera here, a final eye in the sky. The weather shifted dramatically. The temperature dropped steeply, nearing 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The mist that usually dispersed by late afternoon began to coalesce, turning into a heavy, wet fog that aggressively rose from the low ground. It did not just obscure the terrain. It began to swallow the mountain peaks, blurring the transition between rock and sky. It felt less like a natural weather phenomenon and more like a curtain being drawn by an unseen hand. Then came the smell, now undeniable, potent and closer. It was carried on the updraft, a rank, metallic odor like exposed iron left to rust in a swamp, mixed with the sickening sour stench of old bodily fluids and burnt chemicals. It was the scent of the contaminated, and it was moving in force. Nathan radioed Randall. "The curtain is dropping. Scent signature is strong and spreading fast. They are using the fog for cover." "Understood, Sergeant." Randall's voice crackled back, calm and steady. "They will be here within the hour. Get back quickly." Nathan made the rapid, dangerous descent, barely making it back to the cabin before the fog completely obliterated visibility. He found Randall standing just outside the front door, his back to the frame. The last light of the day made his amber eyes gleam intensely. "The time for human preparation is over, Sergeant," Randall said, his voice a low vibration. "I must be what I am." He did not ask Nathan to look away. He did not flinch. The transformation was horrific and beautiful in its violence. It began not with a scream, but with a deep guttural shudder that racked Randall's immense frame. The sounds that followed were agonizing, the dry, splintering crack of human bones stretching and reshaping, the wet, elastic sound of muscle mass increasing exponentially, ripping through the expensive tweed. His spine elongated, his shoulders broadened, pushing out of his coat like a collapsing granite monolith. Ash-gray fur erupted, thick and bristly, covering him in seconds. The transformation took perhaps 7 seconds, but it felt like an eternity compressed into agonizing sound. When the sound ceased, the creature that stood where Randall had been was the Wolf Commander, nearly 9 feet tall at the shoulder when standing on its hind legs, radiating immense, controlled power. The amber eyes, though set in a bestial muzzle, retained their chilling, focused intelligence. There was no terror in the beast's gaze, only concentrated duty. The wolf lifted its massive head, inhaling the contaminated air, parsing the location of the invisible threat. It gave a short, commanding huff of air, a signal Nathan instinctively understood. "They are close. Stand ready." Nathan retreated into the cabin, chambering a round in the Remington rifle. He felt his pulse hammering, a drumbeat against the overwhelming silence. He was a man armed with steel and gunpowder, standing shoulder to shoulder with the legend of chaos, waiting for the true nightmare to arrive in the suffocating fog. The first wave hit the cabin at exactly 12 o'clock and 6 minutes in the morning, according to Nathan's luminous wristwatch. It was not a coordinated assault. It was a hungry surge, a chaotic flood. The acoustic alarms chimed simultaneously from 3 different directions, a rapid, urgent chorus of tin cans and rocks scattering. Then came the tearing sound. Not the sound of a heavy beast crashing through the brush, but the wet, ripping noise of brush being effortlessly disintegrated by objects moving too fast for the density of the forest. Randall, the massive wolf, was instantly engaged. He did not retreat inside. He stood his ground on the small wooden porch, utilizing the elevated position and the narrow door frame as a tactical advantage. The contaminated were everything Randall had warned about. They were shapeless, horrifying parodies of the wolf form, some running on 4 legs but with jutting starved ribs, others lunging awkwardly on 2, their arms too long ending in wicked curved claws. They were pale, covered in patchy, decaying fur that was slick with the moisture of the fog, and they moved with frenetic, manic energy. The sound was a sickening medley. Randall's deep, powerful snarls countered by the high, ragged shriek of the contaminated. Nathan, inside the cabin, positioned himself at a reinforced window, the heavy glass trembling from the vibrations outside. He engaged with his rifle. He ignored the conventional aiming points. These things did not feel pain in the human sense. Instead, he fired short, calculated bursts at the moving joints, knees, elbows, shoulders, trying to break their momentum and disable their horrifying speed. Randall was a living, breathing shield. The contaminated struck him repeatedly, the blows sounding like axes hitting wet meat, but his ash-gray hide absorbed the impact. He was massive, using his bulk and the powerful swing of his jaws to eliminate threats in devastating, concise movements. He focused on the nearest enemies, tearing at their necks and crushing their rib cages with terrifying finality. Nathan's illumination rounds helped. The blinding, tactical lights mounted near the perimeter momentarily stunned the creatures, giving him an instant to track and fire. One of the contaminated, a tall, sinewy horror, managed to leap onto the porch and sank its claws into Randall's massive shoulder. Randall roared, not in pain but in sheer cold fury, and with a single brutal twist of his neck, he shattered the creature's spinal column. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. It was savage, intimate, and deafening. The air was thick with the scent of spent gunpowder, freshly spilled oily blood, and the sour chemical stink of the contaminated. A moment of truth arrived when one of the defeated creatures landed awkwardly on the small stretch of lawn directly beneath Nathan's window. It lay still. Its unnatural movements ended. Nathan aimed the light directly onto it. It was undeniably a former man. Its torso was elongated, ribs jutting outward in a grotesque cage, and its limbs were bent at impossible angles. Its face was the most horrifying part, stretched and twisted, the remnants of human features locked in a rictus of pure, unintelligent hatred. Its eyes, wide and white, possessed no spark of consciousness, only the vacant, animalistic aggression of a mind utterly lost. This was not a monster from a legend. This was a physical, biological tragedy. Randall ended the siege with a massive, shaking roar that tore the very fog apart. It was a command, heavy and resonant, that spoke of ancient dominance. The remaining contaminated, unable to process the sound of uncorrupted power, retreated into the fog, their chaotic movements fading into the deep woods. The silence that followed was heavy with exhaustion and death. Randall, his massive form smeared with dark blood that failed to match his own color, moved slowly. He dragged the limp, ruined bodies into the deep shadow of the pines, his movements purposeful. He left no trace, ensuring no lingering scent of death would draw more of the chaotic surge. He then stood at the edge of the porch, panting heavily, his ash-gray fur matted and dark. Nathan emerged from the cabin, his hands sticky with sweat, the smell of gunpowder searing his nostrils. He approached the colossal wolf cautiously, offering a clean, rolled bandage from his pack. Randall returned to human form slowly, the sound of contracting muscle and receding fur less violent this time, but still intensely unnerving. He bled from several shallow, massive gouges across his side, which were already drawing tight and beginning to seal. They sat in the quiet dark, Nathan cleaning the few places where Randall's skin hadn't closed, pressing sterile gauze to slow the rapid flow of his potent dark blood. They were stronger than I anticipated, Randall admitted, his voice strained. And faster. They ignore pain, Nathan replied, reloading his magazines with methodical clicks. That makes them unpredictable. You took the brunt of it. That was foolish. Randall looked up, his amber eyes unwavering. It was necessary. I cannot risk those things getting close enough to corrupt your weapon supply. You are the defense of the second layer. I am merely the primary wall. A new understanding solidified between them, rooted in the visceral reality of gunpowder and torn flesh. Nathan had witnessed pure savagery and had actively provided tactical support to the apex predator. He had defended a mythical creature from a greater horror. I spent my life protecting people who were scared of the enemy I was fighting, Nathan observed, capping his cleaning solution. Now I am protecting something people would kill instantly out of fear. You said something about the truth before. Randall leaned back, watching the shadows retract with the slow approach of dawn. Fear is the easiest lie. It tells you that anything outside your understanding is wrong. You protected men in wars of men. Now you protect order from chaos. The truth, Sergeant Cole, is often simply what you choose to destroy, and what you choose to defend. The bond was sealed, forged in the terror of the night and the sickening scent of the contaminated. Nathan understood he was now fully committed to a war that transcended human reality. The next 3 days were defined by relentless, silent work. There was no rest. The brief, violent clash had confirmed the contaminated were still active, circling and regrouping. Nathan and Randall agreed to shift tactics, from static defense to active patrolling and elimination of the enemy's strongholds. They moved through the dense forest, a bizarre, highly effective tandem. Nathan, wearing a ghillie suit and moving with the silent, economical tread of a trained operative, scanned the terrain with his thermal viewer, checking the high ridges and the tight shadows. Randall, in his full transformation, moved alongside him, a massive ash-gray shadow that relied on instinct, scent, and hearing. Nathan was constantly amazed by Randall's stealth. For a creature of such colossal weight, Randall moved with the grace of flowing water, melting into the dense brush, his passage marked only by the gentle swaying of high ferns that immediately sprang back into place. They operated as a single, multifaceted organism. Nathan's cold, mechanical eye against Randall's visceral, ancient senses. It was Randall who found the first nest. He froze instantly, his head snapping upwind, issuing a low, almost subsonic growl that vibrated in Nathan's bones. The location was hidden deep beneath a massive, overturned root structure, a natural tangle of earth and rock. It was a shallow, horizontal den, reeking of the familiar stomach-turning mix of wet decay, feces, and metallic rust. The entrance was small, but Randall nudged it open with his snout, revealing a churning darkness within. Nathan trained his flashlight inside. The air inside was thick and viscous. They found remnants, gnawed bones of deer and mountain goats, but also the unmistakable long bones of human limbs, stripped clean. The ground was slick with fluids and littered with foul, organic waste. "This is where they wait," Randall rumbled, his voice a vibration in his chest. "Where they sink into the agony of their change. They rest here until hunger drives them out." The tactical response was immediate and focused on absolute sanitation. Nathan carried 4 thermite grenades reserved for this exact purpose. Thermite burns at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a purifying, inescapable flame. Nathan positioned himself with the Remington rifle, covering the den entrance. Randall stood as a massive, unmoving wall of muscle and fur, protecting Nathan from any unexpected approach from the rear. Nathan pulled the pins and tossed the grenades deep into the burrow. They ignited with a dazzling, brilliant white flare, accompanied by the hiss and roar of chemical fire. The stench that erupted from the hole was overwhelming. Searing, metallic, and utterly sickening. The smell of flesh and bone turning instantly to ash. As the fire raged, Nathan felt a subtle but profound shift in his own operational methods. He started to rely less on the objective reality of his equipment and more on the subjective certainty of Randall's instinct. A silent, deep rumble from Randall was more predictive of danger than any acoustic sensor. If Randall twitched his ears toward the southeast, Nathan automatically aimed his weapon there, even if the thermal view was clear. His internal resistance to the utterly irrational nature of his ally vanished. This creature, this massive wolf, was not the chaotic monster of legend. It was a sentinel, burdened by an ancient duty, carrying the immense weight of required control. The danger was not Randall. The danger was what happened when Randall or his kind failed to control their power. They eliminated 2 more smaller nests over the next day, each operation identical. Randall locating, Nathan sterilizing with fire, Randall covering. The mountain began to feel clean, the sour scent retreating, replaced by the crisp, cold air of the higher altitudes. As they circled back, however, Nathan spotted a disturbance that brought them both to a sudden halt. It was on a steep, muddy slope, a few hundred feet below the established tree line. Clear, distinct imprints in the saturated earth. Not the wide, gouging tracks of Randall or the scrambling, chaotic marks of the contaminated. These were the tracks of a human being. Heavy commercial-grade boots with a distinct, deep tread pattern, the kind worn by the mercenaries from the destroyed camp. There was only one set of tracks. They were heading down the slope, away from the contaminated zones, moving with a desperate, stumbling gait, but definitely moving. "One survived," Nathan murmured, lowering his thermal scope. Randall, who had already scented the tracks, turned his massive head toward Nathan. His gaze was piercing. The implications were chilling. If one of the hunters had survived the assault and fled, then the threat was contained. But these tracks headed downhill, moving toward the deeper woods, potentially toward the access road. If that survivor reached a rendezvous point, or if he possessed a satellite phone, he would not be calling for help. He would be calling for reinforcement, or worse, reporting the location of Randall. A wave of urgent foreboding washed over Nathan. The man was not running home. He was moving with purpose. The fight was about to expand. The survivor came to the cabin the following evening, drawn by the faint scent of wood smoke and the promise of human shelter. The storm had returned, a cold, driving rain that turned the mountain slopes into slick, dangerous rivers of mud. Nathan and Randall were prepared. They sat in near-total darkness, listening to the rain lash the windows. Nathan had strategically left a small, faint light burning inside the hearth, visible only through a thin slit in the boarded window. The sound reached them just before the figure arrived, a stumbling, broken approach, punctuated by gasping sobs that the man tried and failed to stifle. Randall was in human form, sitting by the hearth, his body still healing from the cumulative damage of the past nights. He was alert, silent, a massive silhouette against the faint glow. Nathan, armed with the pistol, waited by the door, utilizing the peephole he had drilled earlier. The man who finally reached the porch was a ruin. He was one of the mercenaries, his expensive field gear ripped and mud-caked. His face was smeared with dirt and dried blood, his eyes wide and red, betraying a complete break with reality. He did not knock. He simply began beating weakly on the door with his fists, issuing fractured, incoherent pleas. They move without sound. They're not animals. They taste the air. He slurred, collapsing onto the porch boards. Nathan slid the bolt back swiftly, threw the door open, and pressed the muzzle of the pistol against the man's throat before he could react. The mercenary froze, eyes rolling up in his head. "Drop the weapon," Nathan commanded, noticing the man still clutched a heavy combat knife. The man whimpered, letting the knife clatter to the porch floor. Randall stood, moving toward the man with slow, deliberate steps. He did not look threatening, but the sheer size and silent intensity of the man was enough to crush the mercenary's already fragile sanity. Nathan dragged the man inside, bound his hands with zip ties, and forced him into a chair. The man was beyond coherent interrogation, stuck in a loop of terror. Randall, however, began to talk to him, his voice low, steady, and strangely mesmerizing. "The things you saw," Randall said, not asking but stating. "They were not the trophies you sought. Who sent you, mercenary? Who broke the chain?" The man shuddered violently. It was less an interrogation and more a psychological peeling away of layers. The mercenary, whom Nathan now recognized as the shooter from the destroyed camp, began to confess not out of fear of Nathan's gun, but out of a desperate need to externalize the horror. "We were hired," the mercenary whispered, staring at Randall's amber eyes. "We knew they were here, the big wolves, but we were paid double to ensure none of them survived the first attack. It wasn't about the kill. It was about the corruption." Randall leaned in, his expression tightening into a look of ancient, unbearable dread. "Tell me the name of the one who paid the gold," Randall commanded. The mercenary choked on the air. He said you had to fall. He wanted the mountains ruined, Lord. He wanted the chaos unleashed. Then came the true, chilling reveal, delivered in a rush of hysterical breath. "The one who hired us, he said he was waiting at the summit. He said he knew you. He said, he's a part of you." Nathan watched Randall's reaction. The weariness in the Lord's eyes intensified, transforming into a deep, sickened knowledge. The powerful man seemed to shrink, struck by a massive, unseen blow. The yellow eyes filled not with rage, but with a profound, terrifying sorrow. My brother Randall whispered, the name a profound tragedy. He turned away from the mercenary, his jaw working. The confession was complete. The mercenary, having delivered the truth, was spent. His role was over. "Let him go, Sergeant," Randall ordered, his voice raw. "He's a witness. He'll bring them back." "No." Randall cut him off, shaking his head slowly. "His mind is broken. His path is ended. He will die on the slope before he reaches the valley. His story will be incoherent madness. He is a casualty of this betrayal. Nothing more." Nathan cut the plastic restraints. The mercenary stumbled out into the rain without a word of thanks, disappearing into the black storm, already lost. Randall stood before the hearth, his hands gripping the mantelpiece until his knuckles were white. "He is my twin. The younger of the line," Randall explained, his voice flat with pain. "We were both given the gift, the duty. I accepted the burden of control. He could not bear the silence, the isolation, the constant denial of pure, untamed strength. He sought power without duty, rage without reason. The brother had fallen, using the mercenaries to eliminate Randall's disciplined pack, deliberately ensuring the lineage devolved into the contaminated. The attack was not to kill Randall, but to force his hand, to draw him out, and to infect his mountain sanctuary with inescapable chaos. He has been waiting. He wants the final confrontation," Randall concluded, turning to face Nathan, the shadow of the wolf crossing his human features. "And he is waiting at the highest point, at the cliff of the fall." The ascent began 2 hours before dawn. The rain had ceased, but the air was saturated, and the fog had thickened into an unnatural, cloying substance. It felt heavy, cold, and it carried a new, insidious odor. They moved toward the highest peaks, toward the old deserted pass that Randall referred to as the Cliff of the Fall, a place of historical significance for his lineage, a site meant for meditative peace and strategic overview. As they gained altitude, the terrain grew sparse and rocky, and the fog became less vapor and more suffocating atmosphere. Nathan's lungs felt heavy, and the visibility dropped to mere yards. The air was undeniably poisoned. The metallic tang was present, but overlaying it was a scent Nathan recognized, yet was hideously distorted, the powerful, earthy scent of Randall in his transformed state, but turned sour, acidic, and rancid. It was the scent of corrupted kinship, of a perverted mirror image. Randall, moving in his human form, saving his strength for the imminent duel, walked with grim determination. His face was set in a mask of agonizing duty. "He is poisoning the mountain," Randall muttered, gesturing toward the fog. "He is filling this place with his defeat. This is not just a duel for dominance. It is a battle for the soul of the mountain itself." They found the lair of the brother just before the ridgeline. It was not a natural den like those of the contaminated, but a structure, a rough, shallow alcove beneath a massive, fractured slab of schist. It was lined not with leaves or moss, but with the refuse of intentional, deliberate horror. The clean-picked bones of various animals, arranged in geometric patterns, and fragments of ancient tarnished silver, the stolen and desecrated relics of Randall's family line. It was evidence of a twisted yet intelligent mind at work. As Nathan raised his rifle, the darkness within the alcove shifted, solidifying into a colossal, ragged form. The brother emerged, stepping out of the shadows and into the thin gray light that permeated the fog. He was massive, easily Randall's size, but his transformation was pathological. His ash-gray fur was sparse and matted, sticking out in angry clumps. His limbs were disproportionately long, and his movements were jerky, unnatural. His jaw was exposed on one side, raw bone showing where the lip had been torn away, giving him a perpetual silent snarl. But the eyes, they were the most terrible part. They were pure, empty white, stripped of any iris or pupil, entirely devoid of intellect, burning with nothing but pure, singular hatred. He was the epitome of the contaminated, yet possessing a core intelligence, a malignant purpose. The creature focused its empty gaze on Randall. It did not snarl or roar. It issued a dry, rattling hiss that bespoke immense, suppressed rage. Nathan sighted the rifle, aiming for the creature's massive chest, ready to pump 3 rounds into the target. Randall moved instantly, blocking the line of fire, his hand raised in a stopping motion. "No, Sergeant." "Not yet," Randall commanded, his voice tight. "He's feral, Randall. Let me put him down. It is personal. It is the blood of the line. This is my penance, my burden," Randall whispered, his eyes never leaving the corrupted form of his brother. "I cannot allow you to stain yourself with this kinslaying. This is the last duty of the Lord." Randall did not wait for argument. He stepped forward, his body swelling instantly. The transformation this time was swift, violent, and utterly deliberate. A declaration of ancient power meeting a profound corruption. In seconds, the clean, powerful, muscular figure of Randall stood opposite the twisted horror of his brother. The contrast was shocking. Randall, pristine and massive, representing disciplined power. The brother, hunched and pathological, representing power run to madness. Duty against self-annihilation. Randall's massive head dipped in a single, tragic nod of acknowledgement. Nathan knew he was watching a tragedy that spanned centuries, and his human weapons were irrelevant. He lowered the rifle, retreating a few yards, scanning the perimeter. The sounds of the duel would undoubtedly draw the remaining contaminated. His new role was simple: tactical containment. He had to ensure this fight stayed isolated. The brother lunged, a terrible, desperate sound escaping his shattered muzzle. Randall met the attack, their colossal forms colliding with the deep, wet force of 2 express trains meeting in a confined space. Nathan realized his tactical training was useless. This was not a fight of angles and cover. It was a brutal, primal wrestling match between 2 impossibly strong, heavy entities fighting on the edge of the world. The flat, rocky plateau atop the ridgeline became the arena for the impossible confrontation. The air was split by the cacophony of the fight. The heavy, shuddering impact of their bodies, the tearing of muscle, and the guttural, choking cries of 2 things too powerful to yield easily. Randall fought with a strategy centered on incapacitation and defense. He used his bulk to absorb the frenzied attacks, trying to pin the brother, to force him into submission, perhaps hoping that the act of dominance might shock the corrupted mind back into function. The brother, however, fought with the pure, unadulterated strength of a creature that knew no pain, no fatigue, and no moral restraint. He lunged and slashed, aiming not just to wound, but to utterly obliterate Randall, driven by a hatred that burned hotter than any thermite. Nathan hunkered down behind a low outcrop of gray slate 50 feet away, watched the bloody duet unfold. His soldier's brain worked at hyperspeed. Bullets were a temporary solution at best. If Nathan intervened, he risked distracting Randall or drawing the feral focus onto himself, compromising the primary goal: to eliminate the source of the corruption. He noted the critical difference in their fighting styles. The brother relied only on brute forward force, ignoring the terrain, oblivious to his position. Randall, meanwhile, used the plateau, constantly shifting his weight, trying to leverage the rough ground, steadily pushing his brother backward. Randall moved him toward the western edge of the summit, toward a precipitous drop, largely obscured by the thick, swirling fog. The realization hit Nathan with the cold force of a sudden temperature drop. The mountain itself had to be the weapon. He thought back to his initial defense preparations days ago, when he had planted several heavy seismic charges intended to cause localized rock slides to contain the contaminated on the far side of the valley. He had left the detonator with him, connected by a long, thin wire run through the undergrowth. Now that containment strategy had to become an annihilation strategy. Nathan looked down at the remote trigger unit in his hand. It was a crude, heavy device designed to detonate a series of charges along a 200-yard line of stress fractures he had located on the lower slope. Activating it now, while the two titans struggled at the apex, was suicidal. The force of the detonation causing a massive, calculated landslide would destabilize this entire ridge. He knew he would be lucky to survive the secondary blast and the resulting rock fall. But it was the only way to ensure the contaminated leadership, the source of the chaos, was destroyed, permanently sealed beneath tons of earth. If they both were eliminated, the secret would be preserved. Randall was faltering. The brother, using a brutal, focused thrust, managed to slash deeply across Randall's chest, the wound instantly sealing but sapping massive reserves of energy. Randall was backed against the precipice, the cold fog swirling around his hocks. Randall looked up, his amber eyes catching Nathan's gaze through the gloom. There was no terror in the look, only a final deep resignation. He let out a final raw cry, not of battle fury, but a desperate, guttural sound of farewell, acknowledging his failure to contain the familial corruption. He was losing. The brother was closing for the final annihilating blow. Nathan closed his eyes, his finger finding the cold plastic button of the detonator. This was no longer a tactical decision. This was a sacrifice. He inhaled the stench of ozone and the damp earth one last time. He had found his final purpose, his last oath. Nathan pressed the button. There was a half-second of silence, a dreadful pause before the earth reacted. Then the mountain roared. The first series of explosions were deep and visceral, not sharp cracks of gunpowder, but the muffled, colossal thump-thump-thump of heavy seismic charges detonating deep within the granite substructure of the ridge. The sound of the detonation was instantly dwarfed by the consequence. The ground beneath Nathan's feet lurched violently, and a terrible grinding sound erupted from the lower slopes. The sound of millions of tons of stone, earth, and ancient timber coming unbound. The sound of the landslide was all-consuming. It was a rolling, deafening thunder that swallowed the brother's final, victorious shriek, Randall's last defeated cry, and the incessant roar of the wind. Nathan was thrown sideways, his head striking a piece of jagged slate. A metallic taste exploded in his mouth, instantly mixed with fine choking dust and the sharp smell of sulfur. He tried to stay conscious, his vision swimming, focusing desperately on the summit where the fight had been raging. Through the blurring veil of pulverized rock and wet snow kicked up by the shockwave, he saw them. The two colossal shapes, locked in a final bloody tangle, were caught by the instability of the edge. The ground beneath them sheared away. For an instant they were suspended in the foggy air, a writhing knot of gray muscle and rage before gravity seized them. They plunged into the black, invisible maw of the gorge created by the collapsing bluff. The world turned white. Nathan's ears were filled with a high-pitched, painful shriek, a cacophony of escaping air and crashing rock. His awareness faded in and out, the smell of burnt powder and cold rain overriding everything. He felt the mountain shake itself clean, shedding its weight in a final, cataclysmic convulsion. When consciousness returned fully, it was not with a jolt, but a gradual, bone-aching cold. He lay half-buried under a light layer of scree and snow, shivering violently. He checked his extremities. Broken ribs, perhaps, and a nasty laceration on his scalp, but functionally he was intact. He struggled to his feet, tasting the gritty mixture of dust and blood. The sky was still gray, the sun yet to rise, but the fog had dissipated rapidly, pulled away by the violence of the landslide. He stumbled toward the ridgeline. Where the rocky plateau had been, there was now a sheer, terrifying drop-off. The entire western flank of the summit had collapsed. Below, the forest was gone, replaced by a massive, deep fan of freshly pulverized rock, earth, and shattered timber, completely filling the deep gorge. The slide had traveled hundreds of feet down, sealing off the lower pass decisively. It was absolute. Nothing survived that descent and subsequent burial. Nathan stood at the edge, listening. He searched for residual sounds, for the faint echo of a snarl or the scraping of rock. There was nothing. The silence that settled upon the mountain was unlike anything Nathan had ever experienced. This was the silence of total negation. The chaos was eliminated. The order was eliminated. The ancient blood feud, the war of instinct versus reason, was over, swallowed entirely by the mountain itself. Nathan stood as the single, fragile witness. He looked at the massive, permanent scar on the flank of the Appalachian peak, a monument to a secret conflict no human could ever comprehend. He was alive, inexplicably, but he knew he was now entirely alone with the weight of that buried truth. Nathan returned to the cabin in the late morning, moving like a specter through the scarred landscape. His body was a map of bruises, scrapes, and strains, but his mind was crystal clear, focused entirely on the final, necessary act of disappearance. The cabin was silent, untouched by the cataclysm above. It felt hollow, no longer a refuge or a stronghold, but merely a box of wood and stone where a terrible, magnificent war had briefly found its center. As he reached the front door, his hand hesitated on the knob. He saw it then, a mark deeply scored into the heavy, untreated pine of the door frame, low to the ground. It was not a knife mark. It was a deep, curving gouge, scored by immense force and ending in a blunt, wide tip, a claw mark. Beneath the mark, carved with startling precision, were 4 small, deliberate indentations. Nathan read the message left by the Lord in his transformed state, a final, wordless testament of acceptance. You were worthy. It was a validation of his unexpected duty, a final acknowledgement of his honor in choosing to eliminate the violence, even if it meant destroying the honorable warrior alongside his enemy. Nathan went inside. He gathered his own minimal belongings, maps, tools, and the remaining tactical gear. He then began the process of erasure. He carried the remnants of Randall's expensive, bloodied tweed to the hearth. and laid the clothing on the cold stones. He burned every scrap of paper, every blood-stained bandage, every map with tactical markings, and every contaminated cleaning patch. He used the remnants of his kerosene to ensure the fire was total and cleansing, leaving only fine white ash. He could not leave a trace of the extraordinary week. No human must ever be drawn back to this place, seeking the secret he now carried. The mountain had sealed the truth with rock. Nathan would seal it with silence and fire. He packed his rifle and his service pistol, carefully wiping down the barrel of the Remington. The scent of the cleaning oil no longer comforting, but merely a reminder of the necessary tools of survival. In his heavy canvas rucksack, nestled deep within the survival ration pockets, Nathan placed a single special object. It was a large cartridge, not brass, but pure, dense silver. Randall had given it to him early in their alliance, a ceremonial piece meant to symbolize the unique nature of their war. "It is not for battle," Randall had said. "It is for finality, should the true horror require it." Nathan kept it now, not as a weapon, but as a silent testament, a heavy, cold memento of the duty he had undertaken, and the Lord who had sacrificed himself to maintain dignity in the face of absolute collapse. He locked the cabin, leaving the key under a broken flower pot where it had always been. He did not look back. He walked down the logging trail, leaving the vehicle behind to rust slowly into the earth, ensuring the trail of evidence ended here. He walked out of the Appalachians and back toward the wider, oblivious world of towns and highways. Nathan Cole became a quiet man, traveling light, always choosing the remote, unassuming places. He never spoke of the ash-gray fur, the amber eyes, or the thunder of the mountain's final collapse. He knew the true boundary between the human world and the world of ancient, terrifying instinct. That border was brittle, constantly strained, and he knew that for a time at least it was sealed and silent, resting under a massive shroud of cold stone. But the mountain remembers. In the small, isolated communities nestled at the foot of the peaks, old rumors persist. When the winter blizzards rage the fiercest, when the trails are choked with ice and the air temperature drops far below 0 Fahrenheit, locals whisper of the high pass. They say that sometimes travelers who stray too close to the massive old landslide are suddenly joined by a tall, powerful man in an outdated, dark coat. He never speaks, and his presence is unnervingly dense. Through the driving snow, they catch the faint, unsettling gleam of amber in his eyes, silently directing the lost hikers away from the sealed depths, ensuring that no one disturbs what sleeps beneath the earth.